Hello, I'm Tom Ferguson and welcome to The Fundamental Molecule. This show explores the intersection of water, technology, and entrepreneurship. Each week, I interview innovators, experts, entrepreneurs, and investors in the world of water, helping us understand where this trillion-dollar industry is headed. These are the stories of the people building the future of the world's most valuable and fundamental resource.
Disclaimer. Tom Ferguson is the managing partner of Burton Island Ventures. All opinions expressed by Tom and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Burton Island Ventures. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be viewed as investment advice or relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.
Repeat entrepreneurs are a special breed. They have essentially proved that they operate through skill and not luck. And Wayne Byrne is one of the most skillful. I met him in 2015 in San Francisco as he was picking up one of many awards for OxyMem as they built towards their acquisition by DuPont, his fourth exit in an illustrious career. He's been able to play both the hardware and software games at a very high level indeed, and has been an invaluable source of advice and support both for me personally and for the BIV companies. He's been able to play both the hardware and software games at a very high level indeed, and has been an invaluable source of advice and support both for me personally and for the Burton Island. Please enjoy my conversation with Wayne Byrne. Wayne, welcome. A pleasure to see you as ever.
Pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So I want to start from the top. So when did you first know that you were going to be an entrepreneur?
That's a good question. I suppose I often tell my kids, actually, I'm still trying to figure out what I'm do with the rest of my life. So I suppose I never really, decided one day that I'm going to be an entrepreneur. I think when I look reflectively at my last 30 odd years in business, I've spent more time as an entrepreneur than anything else. So by default, it makes me one. But I don't think I ever set out and decided to be one, if that makes any sense to you.
It certainly does. It certainly does. So what was the on-ramp? What was the first thing that pulled you off into working independently in the kind of broader business world?
I suppose, these days, what do they call it? A side hustle. I've been doing that since, I was probably in my teens, to make a few extra quid and whatnot. So I've always been someone who mastered the side hustle, and I've always struggled to just do one job. I've always enjoyed the financial rewards of being active beyond an 8-hour day. So I've been doing that since probably 14 or 15. And I've carried that habit throughout the rest of my life, really, I suppose.
It's a really interesting one. I didn't spend very much time in anaerobic digestion at all, just a summer in between the two semesters of business school. But that was something that you took a kind of real tilt at. Could you walk us through that story?
It was kind of my early journey into cleantech. I was involved in a waste handling business, and one of the primary partners actually had a substantial toehold in biogas production. I took a really interest in it, and subsequently that brought me into a business that was, I suppose, equipped to identify compelling source of feedstocks, and ultimately began to project develop opportunities both in the United Kingdom and in Ireland. And it was a pretty rewarding and fulfilling journey. But it was not unlike water. It was a protracted timescale to get a project up and running. A lot of capital required. Appeasing local communities and getting their buy-in and getting them engaged around what it is you're trying to ultimately accomplish. But probably the high point for us was we actually managed to deploy a £25 million project in Suffolk that was, I suppose, based on clean inputs. So British Sugar was providing about half of the inputs and the rest was farmed locally. So it was a clean anaerobic digestion plant on about 7 acres with an enormous, I suppose, holding capability for annual crops. And it was the biggest gas to grid project in the United Kingdom at the time. I think we were pipped eventually by Prince Charles's project. But it was a really compelling project, and thoroughly enjoyed being involved in it. So I was involved in lots of smaller ones, but that was certainly the high point. It was 100,000.
It's big biz.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember as a clueless know-nothing sitting on London Bridge. I remember exactly that project. It's funny how the world can be circular in that sense. So You spent a good amount of time outside water before being drawn in. What made you make that leap?
I'd love to say there was leaping involved, but meandering perhaps, or wandering. I suppose I've always been kind of tuned into various opportunities. And certainly when I was in the waste sector, I really narrowed my focus on water. And initially the start was biogas. And, a lot of the subsequent feedstocks that I got involved in were byproducts from wastewater treatment plants. So, as a result, I ended up spending a lot of time at wastewater treatment plants. And that ultimately led me into my first real business, I suppose, in wastewater treatment, which was probably back in 2009, 2010. So I didn't start with any high degree of intent. I just found aspects of it really compelling. And if I'm truthful, probably the most interesting aspect of my water experiences was that I always felt like a spring chicken in water. The only business I've ever been involved with that I've managed to stay reasonably young relative to, those that serve in the marketplace. So it's definitely underserved by the youth. That's for sure.
That is never a truer word. There's a lot of accumulated wisdom. And I think one of the things that we're seeing in the market at the moment is what is going to happen when it collectively decides to go and play golf in Tampa all at the same time. I think the company that you're referring to is OxyMem.
Yeah.
That was the start of it. And you have this sort of long-standing interest in university spinouts. Your ability to stay fingers on the pulse of what's going on in the laboratories of, especially the UK and Ireland, is really kind of remarkable. Like, what is it about that model that you find attractive?
OxyMem definitely started my interest in engaging with technology transfer offices. And I got involved in a second year pilot program with Enterprise Ireland, which is basically a state entity that funds fundamental research and also supports export orientated businesses in the Irish marketplace. And they kind of had this business partners program, which was all about bringing principal investigators together with entrepreneurs and literally seeing what happened. And so it was very early stages. And as a consequence, I remember with a small team of people, we looked at about 4,500 projects on a spreadsheet, and we were supposed to discern from that what was compelling or interesting. So based on your historic competencies and interests, you kind of selected a bunch of opportunities and, reached out to various universities. So I spent about a year visiting nearly every university in Ireland and just engaging with them. And I didn't do a primary degree. So universities for me were, certainly not something that I was comfortable with, and what was really interesting is when I got to know the PIs, to me, these guys were just geniuses, but these geniuses were surrounded by geniuses, typically in a similar, I suppose, discipline area. And, what I began to understand is that they saw me as, some type of commercial genius, which I tried to explain to them, if you just walk down the street, you'll find 5 of me, but, what they have is rare and compelling. So I suppose it was kind of a mutual respect for what they were doing and consequently a respect for what I could potentially do for them. And it seemed to be, a pretty symbiotic proposition. And one that I've kind of found, occurs in most of those environments that I go into. They love to meet people from industry and people who have had experience in taking early stage technologies to market,
Is that a personality fit or an individual kind of esoteric thing? Because we've seen, a lot of examples of that not go kind of particularly well on the academic side. There is a degree of kind of love or engagement with the idea and the qualities of the idea kind of per se versus what are the compromises we're going to have to make to turn this into a business. I mean, did you select for the people who were willing to make those compromises that you didn't think were going to get dogmatic at the worst possible time? Like, how did you think about that?
Yeah, look, I suppose the university environment has often many in there get tarred with a particular brush and they can have challenging views or opinions about potential for their concepts or ideas. And there are those that are willing to leave, I suppose, their perceptions at the door and, engage with you in a meaningful way about how that this could be made a reality. I've met just as many challenging commercial people, so I think in equal measure they exist. But certainly where you see an appreciation for the advice that you're prepared to offer, and consequently when you can see some real genius and defensibility in what is being developed, that's when you recognize a rapport that is worth investing in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an important concept that I think is often addressed way too late in the entrepreneurial journey. Maybe this is a good on-ramp to talk about the OxyMem story. And starting with that notion of defensibility, what about that did you see as defensible, and how did that translate into what was built over time?
I suppose when I initially engaged with the PI, which was Dr. O'Casey, and he was super, super clever guy. And he was the youngest university professor in University College Dublin, which is Ireland's largest university. So we had an initial dialogue. I remember we spoke for about 2 hours. And at the end of the discussion, maybe I understood a very small percentage of what he communicated to me. But I was very open about that. And I said, look, I said, what I've just listened to is really compelling. I said, I don't quite get it or understand it yet. I said, but I'd love to meet you again. And he kind of felt similarly. And so we had probably 3 or 4 really meaningful engagements. So we could really understand what the earliest value proposition could look like. And I really felt that it was something that could have a huge impact on the marketplace. And because they had, I suppose, banked IP, so they had it in the form of a patent, and they had a number of interesting, I suppose, working applications for further patents, I felt that the bases were very well covered in terms of defensibility, but the extended value proposition, even heavily discounted for field performance, was something that you couldn't ignore. And, the principle had been around for probably 30 odd years. I mean, the idea of this had been around for a very long time. So the kind of timing was quite interesting as well,
Yeah, for sure. So some people listening to this won't be aware of OxyMem and the MBR. So why don't you just sort of take us through exactly what the product was that you created, and then this sort of the sort of truncated story of where it went over time, because obviously this was a pretty significant, exit for the water sector, and I think is a really interesting entrepreneurial journey. So do you want to just sort of start from there?
Yeah. So I suppose the underlying technology is known today as the membrane aerated biofilm reactor, and that was a label that Dr. O'Casey actually applied to the technology when put in his first patent in early 2000s, which was really about kind of the control and management of a biofilm that would essentially form on a membrane that could ultimately deliver the aeration capacity needed by a fixed biofilm. As I said to you, this technology had been around since the 70s. The 70s is kind of an interesting period because it was the last major oil crisis. And you had seen a very significant transition from, I suppose, coarse bubble aeration to fine bubble aeration, which happened in the 70s, despite the fact that fine bubble aeration had been around for 20 or 30 years previously, or perhaps even more. But it was this energy crisis that actually drove the shift to this kind of 4x advantage that fine bubble aeration diffusion ultimately delivered. And MABR ultimately offered similar advantages in terms of the energy gains and the process intensification that it ultimately could follow. And I suppose coming into a period where there was a lot of energy sensitivity, a growing awareness around, carbon footprint and so on and so forth, I felt it was perhaps very timely. But a lot of the historic patents had ultimately lapsed. And really the two companies that began to kind of circle around this was ourselves, and which is ultimately known as OxyMem, and GE Water. And so the transition between my first engagement with the PIs and an actual spin out probably took around 3 years. And I would have worked with them in a part-time capacity, no more than maybe 1 or 2 days a month during that transition. And ultimately we were reasonably well funded by Enterprise Ireland and University College Dublin. And we ultimately got to a kind of a position based on the support of Severn Trent Water, and I suppose specifically Bob Steer, that allowed us to validate in the field the value proposition that we ultimately thought we could deliver. So we, in kind of parallel, one of the areas where we felt that, in order to turn this into a real business, one of the big problems that we had to solve was actually the membrane production. Like initially, we naively began the thought process around the fact that we would just buy membranes, probably from the Asian marketplace in large volumes, and we construct a product around that. But we realized rapidly that we couldn't buy the membranes at a low enough cost base. So I actually worked with a small cluster of partners in the south of England, actually, and I found someone who could create a prototype production unit for us. And we became a collaborator on the business. And when we ultimately deployed in Severn Trent and built our first, I suppose, manufacturing pilot, that was the time where we decided actually we were going to go and create a manufacturing facility in the Midlands in Ireland. And we did that kind of around midpoint in 2013. And so we were very fortunate. We got really early stage backing from some really solid business angels in the Irish marketplace, which brought us then into kind of an A-round position where we ultimately got support from Dow Ventures and then subsequently Saudi Aramco Energy Ventures supported the business. So it's one of the businesses where I look back at the funding journey, and it was the one business I never had difficulty raising capital, to be truthful, because it had everything that you would want in a kind of a perfect startup. And that's really testament to the work that the guys did in UCD, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So this brings to mind the idea of partnerships, which historically is pretty complicated for early stage companies. Like, how do you think about partnerships, especially with the larger companies? Because there's a school of thought that says, keep it away, keep your options open. You don't want to sort of tie your little horse to whatever the trap is or some complicated metaphor. Like, how do you think about partnerships? Because it can lead to a lot of spun wheels, wasted time, wasted energy. But I feel like you have a more sort of sanguine view of it. How do you think about that?
I suppose, look, in the early days, the pressure to engage with the majors and identify some traction or interest for your pitch deck is something that, most water tech entrepreneurs feel compelled to certainly engage. What I would say is that the engagement is really important, but you shouldn't do it just for the sake of ticking boxes and decorating your pitch deck. The majors have to tick the boxes because it's the only way they get the volume through the doors in order to figure out who they should be talking to. But what you have to do as an entrepreneur, in my view, is you have to find a synergy that exists uniquely between their organizational needs and your value proposition. And if you can't find that in that partner, then you're probably not with the right partner, in my view. And so if you can figure that out, and it does take time and effort on both sides to do so, then you're on the right track with a partner. Partnership for the sake of partnership, I think, is a waste of time.
How quickly does it take to identify that? Or more importantly, if you invert it, like, how quickly do you know that there isn't a fit there in your experience?
In terms of trying to figure out if it's not there, I think traction is a measure of its absence, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means it hasn't been identified. To be fair to the innovation directors and leaders in these huge organizations, they're seeing a lot of opportunities come across their desk, and the organizations they work for are inordinately large and complex. So it can't be just down to them. You have got to bring the horse to water and get it to drink, So it's something that's really, really important for you to understand. So I don't think it's something that happens overnight. It does take effort, and you definitely have to kiss a lot of frogs to find the prince, so to speak,
Yeah, absolutely. It's metaphor city here at the moment. When you think back, you've been involved in a lot of businesses. When you think about the various things you got involved with, what do you think has separated your entrepreneurial successes from those that didn't go so well?
I think if I was to think about a reflective filter, I think the thing that would have helped me understand sooner that I wasn't on the right track is definitely traction. I keep bringing that up, but if you don't have traction in a business, then you're doing something wrong in terms of your engagement model. What you're offering isn't compelling or so interesting to move deal flow across the board. So the commercial, I suppose, engagements that you are ultimately developing and your pipeline conversion to outcome, and outcome doesn't always mean a $1 million contract. It might be $1,000 contract. When you get the opportunity to pitch your value proposition, are you getting those callbacks? Are you getting people engaged? Are you getting referrals? And you know what? Sometimes if you're not, then that might be a reflection on what you have to offer isn't particularly interesting. And when I do look back, then that becomes a kind of a filter for where I was going wrong. Maybe I should have shut the door earlier, and maybe I shouldn't have raised capital and maybe I should have bootstrapped for longer. Because hunger is a great way to figure out whether you're doing the right thing or not, you know?
Yeah. It's the old adage that it's often more sort of deleterious for a startup to have too much money rather than too little. You know, constraints breed creativity, more likely to die from indigestion than starvation and all the rest of it. It kind of leads into this idea of difficult moments and decision making and the way in which you conduct yourself kind of in the difficult moments. And they're going to come. The pursuit of the entrepreneurial pathway is always going to be stuffed full of things that are really challenging. Are there any sort of principles that you've come up with? I feel like you might say transparency, but I'll leave it to you. Is there anything that you see that has become a kind of a unifying philosophy of like, when things get tough, just remember these couple of things?
The thing that sticks with me most is when those difficult moments occur, and they do occur with some degree of frequency, I have to say. I don't mean every week or every day, but they happen a lot. I mean, a bit like being a race car, you know, you have to go around bends, right? So, you know, sometimes the severity of some of these bends are just extraordinarily difficult. But I always saw them as an opportunity to kind of have, you know, a clarifying moment where it just looks so horrible. And if you embrace the horror of what may play out in days or weeks, who knows, right? This peace comes over you where, well, that's what I found anyway, that you see things for what they really are. And it should or has delivered strategies for me anyway to continue to move forward. Because I suppose that's the difference between, let's say, a resilient entrepreneur and a not so resilient entrepreneur, is that they can get like a rabbit in headlights if they're not used to these clarifying moments, for want of a better description, you know?
For sure. And is this something that you kind of undertake? So the processing of the difficult moments, is this something that you do alone, or do you very actively get the team involved to make sure that, you know, everybody is, you know, staring whatever the problem is in the face, that you've got, you know, as much input as possible, like practically, you know, within a kind of a small organization when stuff gets tough? Or what happens?
Well, I was certainly a believer that, you know, bad news should travel faster than good news. And so when you've got stakeholders, shareholders and key management and leadership, but often those moments occur when the shareholders, stakeholders and key management are are scarce. There's only a few of you, perhaps, you know. So certainly I definitely wouldn't go along with the idea that this is not an issue that you wouldn't share. I have found that discussing it or contemplating it is a lonely task, and that the burden of responsibility as CEO or as maybe founder to find innovative ways around that challenge, I think that's what ultimately the responsibility of a CEO is. I mean, there's nothing stopping the CEO sense checking their convictions or the outcomes that they think they're best pursuing. And not everyone has to agree with them, but I've found it a kind of a lonely challenge. There's no one really can quite get it like I could. It all fell, for the most part, to me to really kind of see past that particular challenge. When those challenges occur now, I see it as it's a big dip, which means that there's potentially a high the other side of that. You'd be surprised how often that is the case, you know?
It sort of brings to this idea of modulation. One of, you know, the helpful skills can be like, don't experience the lows too low and don't experience the highs too high. You know, if you can modulate the top and the bottom, you're going to be able to insulate yourself psychologically, I think far more effectively. And in the context of the loneliness piece, I mean, you know, the CEO, obviously is answerable to the board. Like, how have you historically thought about your board relationships? And now you're on the other side of it. Is that something you ever thought about? How do you think about that relationship?
I always saw it as, I suppose, something that deserved trust, good communication, that it was really a two-way street. Those individuals were in the room because they believed in me and my team. And so I saw it as a process that ultimately would take me to the outcome that I was seeking to achieve. And so I think that I was a great believer in kind of hiding in plain sight, if you understand me. So I would always ensure that, you know, the board had all of the information that they needed to I suppose, to scrutinize the decisions that I was making, to challenge the strategies that I was seeking to execute against, to understand my capital needs, to understand my resourcing needs. And so a robust discussion with people of that caliber is usually a pretty healthy sense check on whether you're doing the right thing or not. And if you don't give those people all of the information, then you probably can't have a complete debate on what it is that you're about to do or encounter. I saw it as kind of the board cadence as kind of an opportunity to demonstrate, that each time we met, we would have overcome or resolved a prior issue. And typically there was another bend around the corner that I was putting before the board. And I would explain that sometimes I say, well, we don't quite know what we're going to do about this, but I'm pretty certain that, myself and my team are going to find a way to navigate around that outcome. And because of prior history, there would be a lot of belief in the team. And I was always a great believer as well in getting the team engaged with the board so that it wasn't just me standing in front of them, if you like. It was a more believable and credible journey if you were standing there as a team.
It's such an interesting one. It reminds me of whenever we ask, when we're selecting companies or looking at what's written, and then we sort of take a look at the risks. Firstly, if they're absent, it's what's bad. What are your risks? We don't have any. Oh yeah? I can give you a list of 14. And if you're not telling me, then how do I know that you're keeping an eye on it? I think that's such an effective, that sort of degree of transparency around, look, there's a bend in the road or sort of a roadblock, or the hay bales are on fire, or like whatever it is. We're not quite sure what we're going to do. This is what we think we're going to do. And it speaks to this idea of the information sort of sharing between all the various stakeholders, but also making sure that you're demonstrating, I think, that you have a learning process, that you have a process through which you're going to get through these tough times. And it makes me think about the learning cycle. Alex Rappaport, we have a standard final question, which we will ask you shortly, about the one lesson from the entrepreneurial experience. And he said, maximize the cadence of your learning cycle. Make sure it's as tight as you possibly can. How have you made sure that that's been the case? I mean, firstly, you may not agree. I'm assuming that you do. But how have you thought about that in your own experience?
What I found is that based on personal limitations, or I'm not a deeply technical person. I'd like to kind of hover at the higher level of things, but I would call myself a generalist. So I can go wide, but not necessarily deep. And so I have to be somewhat selective about what I decide to engage my capacity around. And so the learning cycle for me is typically probably a lot more rounded. And so I'm trying to use, I suppose, a suite of tools that I've developed over the years to ensure that directionally things are correct. And where things aren't, that's where I'll invest time and effort and apply my learnings, if you like, to those areas. So it's more of a kind of a course correction approach, and trying to keep a kind of a Pareto approach here where, if everything was at 80%, well, that would be great. But I have seen, I suppose, more technical entrepreneurs become more obsessive about a deep silo and ignore to their detriment some of the other functional areas within a business. So I suppose my strength is the fact that I'm a generalist. My weakness is the fact that I amn't. And so I need to approach things with the tools that I have. So my capacity to have that deep learning, executed on a technology or a market area that I probably never going to truly understand in a way that a domain expert would, I need to recognize my limitations there,
Exactly. It's this idea of staying out of trouble, right? If you avoid the things that will kill you, then over time, and if you sort of trust in compounding, then kind of good things happen. So I'm sitting here in Brooklyn. You are just outside Dublin. I'm really curious. We wrote a piece earlier this year, right at the beginning of this year, about the strengths of the UK water market. Obviously, Ireland's not in the UK, but you spend more time in the UK and Europe than we do. I was just wondering what your view on the water market for early stage technology is in Europe versus the US. Where do they have an edge, and where do you think they're disadvantaged versus America in particular?
I would say that the European water market is reasonably sophisticated from a research perspective. So I can't remember the numbers precisely, but I think the European output in terms of fundamental research does outperform by a significant degree US research. But unfortunately, up to about 3-4 years ago, kind of fell off a cliff. And so US VCs enjoyed, I suppose, camping out at European universities and nurturing innovation at a relatively early stage. And as a consequence, there was a lot of flight in intellectual property across the water in terms of ownership. And so, I think the Europeans have probably cottoned on to that and have recognized that, they need to do an awful lot more in terms of nurturing beyond the university and ultimately give an off-ramp or a runway to compelling innovation. And I think they've done an awful lot, particularly with the likes of EIC grant availability. And they really do seem to have engineered a route for innovation. That's something they've solved that I don't think needed solving in the US. A lot of capital in the US, that's for sure, and a lot of capability. I think that the entrepreneurial spirit in the US probably shines brighter than it does in Europe. There's a hesitancy, and I can see why, because if you don't have the capital structures in place, then there's going to be some hesitancy. That's where I've seen some major differences. I do think in terms of early stage innovation, beachhead or showcase opportunities, I do think it's easier to execute in Europe. And that's not based on any data, just experience. I think that because of the scale and the reach of some of the brands that exist within Europe, you can do something really compelling with someone like Severn Trent Water or Thames Water, and that can mean something in, multiple geographies and can put you on the map. So I think that's certainly an advantage. It's an opportunity that's just as open to a US entity or North American entity as it is a European one if there's a localized presence. I think in terms of the way the markets are structured, I think they're broadly just as complicated to enter. They're different, but they're complex and large and risk averse. So all those things play out. If I was to talk just very briefly about kind of other markets, which I do think need to be on an entrepreneur's radar, certainly the Middle East and the Chinese marketplace are areas where if you have a scalable technology, and I mean really scalable, it is a market that can lift you more rapidly, or those markets can lift you more rapidly because of a lack of risk aversion. In fact, if anything, a propensity to embrace bleeding edge technology to gain advantage over archaic consulting-led infrastructure approach in Europe and North America. I mean, a good example in China would be, you do a 1-ton trial, you do a 100-ton trial, and then the next question is, when can we do 1 million tons? That's a little bit simplified, but it moves really, really fast there. And the same in the Middle East. They have some inordinately large projects and they are willing to take technical risk on some of these challenges. So, that's something that if you have a scalable proposition, that there are certainly markets that should be in your peripheral vision for sure.
On a practical basis, how do you affect that kind of market entry? I mean, is this relationship based? How have you gone about it? Maybe with a practical example, I don't know.
The best piece of advice I got from the CEO of Saudi Aramco Energy Ventures at this stage, probably 6 years ago, Majid Mufti, he said, after they invested in us, he said, just keep showing up. He said, this is all about building rapport and relationships. And we did. I went out there every 6 weeks and I made sure that I engaged and embraced, partners market, did kind of versions of lunch and learns. I really did actually, follow that piece of advice and it really paid off for us. And the Chinese market is different. You have to build trust and rapport. You can't just show up once and hope for an order. I would say there's probably 18 months to 2 years worth of effort required, not every 6 weeks, but you need to show up and show that you're committed to the marketplace. And actually they respond incredibly favorably to that type of support. And they really do, they really enjoy working with European and North American entrepreneurs. It's a very different marketplace, but you can navigate it. It's, because it's water, it's relatively small. I mean, anyone who's done the water circuit globally recognizes the people they meet, at the various conferences. It's the same people that keep showing up. And it is actually quite a small cohort of people that can influence purchasing decisions or partnerships or market access, It
always amazes me that we sort of sit here in our $1 trillion market that sits at the basis of all human society, that everybody refers to as a niche. And that you really do you really do end up seeing the same sort of set of people that are interested in or responsible for this next stage of technological innovation. Talking about it, it makes me think that the thing that unifies, it feels to me, the Middle East and China in particular, but I feel like a lot of other people coming into this tent is an extremity of need. So the Middle East have really decided that they're going to sort of create the future of water management. And then China has no choice. I mean, their third largest river has run dry. Some crazy pictures that we're seeing at the moment. Obviously, that is being mirrored in the EU. I'm curious, like, you've been around the water sector now for like well over a decade. Do you think we're getting to a sort of a degree of pain and a degree of hurt and a degree of immediacy that we're going to see dynamism in this market that we haven't seen before?
I'd love to say yes, but I don't know. I suppose I continue to look at the challenges that we face, and I continue to reflect on the fact that to have a real impact, you have to find and track entrants that are going to have exponential growth potential in an infrastructure heavy market. And, so you're kind of looking for companies that can engage on infrastructure projects that are growing like a SaaS business. I just haven't seen that show up yet. I keep hoping for it, but you still got to pour concrete. You still got to mobilize people. It requires a lot of physical capital infrastructure in order to ultimately affect outcomes,
Absolutely. Well, it also takes financial infrastructure. And one of the things that you've been working on is a project or entity called Method Capital. Could you say a little bit about what that does and what change you're trying to affect with it?
After DuPont acquired OxyMem, at that stage, I think I'd look back over the last 15 years and I had been involved in 4 significant exits, and I recognized that I probably had to offer up more of my founder equity than I would have ordinarily wanted to do so. And so I began to think about, well, is there a better way to fund the scaling capital needs of early stage innovators serving kind of sustainability and climate tech? And the more I looked around, the more I realized that it didn't really exist. And so the thesis was that if we could find a founder-friendly, non-dilutive source of project finance, that would be a really compelling way to encourage exponential growth of those type of infrastructure businesses that I spoke about, where the balance sheet risk didn't sit with the end user, the balance sheet risk sat with the funder. So, we started out fairly bootstrapped, single funder, a small ring-fenced fund. And we've kind of grown and tailored that now to a point where we currently work with 4 funds. We're a deal originator. Effectively, what we're doing is we're matching, typically in first world markets, climate or sustainability tech that can have a real impact. In other words, it's delivering a high double-digit IRR with a counterparty that offers a low default risk, wrapped with contracted inputs and outputs. And what we end up with is basically something that can be offered to the end user somewhat like a service or a SaaS model, as I kind of alluded to there. And they just pay for the outcomes that they're looking for. And the funder ultimately provides the capital to enable those outcomes. That's the premise of the offering. And it really has blown up, I suppose, in the last kind of 12 to 18 months. And the side of it I'm probably most heavily involved in is kind of the biz dev side, because I meet people like me with a high degree of regularity. So I exchange contacts and details, but it's my partners that do the hard work. If you understand me, in terms of getting those contracts to a point where they can get to financial close and draw down and ultimately execute those projects. But it's a business that's really willing to take scale risk. So if you have a deployment of, $1 million or 10,000 cubes, then we'll take anywhere from 10 to 20x scale risk on the next project, which means that you can follow that kind of exponential curve rather than that kind of incremental growth trajectory that most water innovators find themselves on,
Such an important intervention. We have no lack of things being built, but the actual kind of picks and shovels that will, allow people to move up that scale curve quickly is sort of sadly lacking. So before we get to our final question, I wanted to ask one kind of intermediary question that I've found myself wondering about over the last couple of days. What have you learned from being an entrepreneur that has served you well from being a parent, and vice versa? What have you learned from being a parent about being an entrepreneur?
In many respects, it's a bit like managing a cohort within a venture entity. I would say focus and impact, right? So, I think that I focus on the things that I can control, and I try to, I suppose, wander into things that I can influence. My approach with my children is not too different to the approach that I engage with in industry. I only get involved in things that I can actually have an impact on or an influence on. And I suppose when I kind of look at the family situation, I've got 4 kids and I have no exits yet. So I don't know whether I'm doing a good job at home. Hopefully my wife is doing a better one, and I'm sure she is. But I mean, look, there's only a small number of things that you can do to kind of shape those children. And sometimes they disappoint you and sometimes they make you really proud. On balance, so long as they're delivering more positives than negatives, I suppose that's a good read on whether you're going the right direction,
I love that. Focus and impact. I think words to live by. So our final question. So what is the one lesson from your entrepreneurial experience that you would pass on to any emerging water founder?
Per the top of the call, I think that the principle of traction is something that is underestimated by many water entrepreneurs. The conditions for success principally lie across kind of the 4Ts, the total addressable market, traction, the team, and the technology or the defensibility of the proposed technology. But I think the most important thing of them all is traction. It's the thing that offers some degree of evidence to both the entrepreneur and potential funders, potential partners, potential alliances that actually they're going in the right direction. So I think that can't be underestimated. That is where I would definitely give a lot of attention to it.
Absolutely. When you feel that demand pull, you're on the right track.
Definitely.
Wayne, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.